The June special meeting of the Toowoomba Regional Council. This meeting is open to the public and will be live streamed. I'd like to thank all of you in the room today and acknowledge everyone who's watching on Council's social media channels. I'd like to acknowledge the Mayor, Councillor Antonio, Deputy Mayor, Councillor Jeff McDonald, Portfolio Leader, Councillor Carl, Councillors, CEO Mr Pigeon and the General Manager Mr Summers. I'd like to acknowledge the Aboriginal parties whose songlines traverse these lands we meet on today, the Western Waka Waka, Guyabul and Jarrawa peoples, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the knowledge, rich traditions and bold ambitions of Australia's First Peoples. We have one apology today, Councillor Melissa Taylor. Do we have any? We don't have any leave of absences or granting leave of absences. We have one declaration. Mr Mayor.
Councillors...
beg your pardon, sorry Mr Mayor.
I move that we accept the apology.
Thank you Councillor Taylor and Councillor McMahon. All those in favour? Thank you. Councillor Antonio.
On the 16th of February I required that it was minuted by Council that I believe I had a declarable conflict of interest in relation to a potential wind farm to be built by Vestas in the Captain's Mountain area. It is my intention to take no part in any discussion from the Council perspective in relation to this project. At the same time, I advise that should a report be presented for consideration, I will leave the room and stay away from the place where the meeting is being held while the report is being discussed. Madam Chair, I'll honour that now.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. With that, can I have someone move the suspension of standing orders, please? Councillor Von Hoff and Councillor McDonald, all those in favour? Thank you. I make reference to the Mayor's declaration and we move to item number 4.
Madam Chair, did I leave some keys down there?
Keys. No, you haven't left your keys here.
Go by the code.
There's keys here.
Here.
Okay, thank you Richard, some keys.
They're on your desk.
We'll move to item number 4, which is material change of use impact undefined use, and Richard Green is going to take us through that. Thank you, Richard.
Thank you. Could we just move to attachment number 2, if we could? There we go. Thank you. Thank you. This application seeks a development permit for a material change of use for an undefined use, and that being a meteorological mast on land located at 9426 Gore Highway, Captain's Mountain. And that's approximately 15 kilometres southwest of Millmerran. So just to get your bearings if this works, so our site here is 3 land parcels just there, and then of course you've just got the township of Millmerran just up there. So as I said, the subject site comprises 3 land parcels, has a combined area of approximately 712 hectares and is located within the rural zone 100 and 200 hectare minimum precinct. And if I could just move to attachment 4, if I could, as well. We might leave it at that. I'll just talk to it while it's coming up. The site's currently utilised for the purpose of cattle grazing and it's improved by a dwelling house and ancillary structures. The application seeks to allow the construction of the mast within the subject land for the purposes of climatic monitoring to assist in determining the site's suitability for the possible future establishment of a wind farm. The mast itself will be located within the northern portion of the site, so once again that's why I've got that here. So there you go, it's that small area there. And that's the Gore Highway sort of running along there. And then they've got a lovely little access track, sort of informal gravel track running up to it. And then while I talk, if we could move to attachment 5 as well. We're jumping over the place, but it gives you an idea of what it looks like. The mast itself is a steel lattice construction. It's a maximum height of 105 metres and it'll be supported by guy wires. The mast will be equipped with wind and weather sensors at various heights, which will allow measurements of wind speed, wind direction, wind shear, wind turbulence and air density, amongst other data. The mast will be fitted with lightning arresters and grounded at the base of the tower and at each of the guy wire supports. The electronic systems on the mast will utilise a 12-volt power system consisting of a battery storage unit charged by a small solar array attached to the tower. So, whilst I haven't got the exact one up here at the moment, you can see basically this is an example of what the Met mast will look like, and there the guy wires coming off the side there, and in the centre is the lattice tower, if you will. The mast occupies a limited footprint area of the subject site with only the tower base and guy wire anchor points, and there's 6 of those, physically connected to the ground, allowing for the continued use of the land for agricultural purposes. The tower base and anchor points will be provided with anti-climb protection and cattle panel fencing to avoid damage by livestock. Vehicle access to the mast will be provided via an existing crossover adjoining the Gore Highway and an unsealed gravel access track to the tower site. Now, building activity associated with the construction of the mast is anticipated to be completed within 5 days, and this includes the installation and testing of all sensors and equipment. Once operational, minimal access will be required to conduct routine maintenance with an average of 2 to 3 site visits per year by a light vehicle. The mast itself is located within a cleared portion of the site, away from any mature vegetation. In this regard, any vegetation growth within the vicinity of the mast will be monitored and, where necessary, removed as part of routine maintenance. Now, given that the purposes of the mast is to obtain meteorological data to assist in determining the site's suitability for the possible future establishment of a wind farm, the use itself is only temporary. The lifespan of the use is up to 5 years, after which time the tower, all infrastructure and equipment will be removed and the land returned to pre-development state. On this point, it's noted that the construction of the mast on the site does not itself confirm that a wind farm will ultimately be established on the site. Any subsequent decision to establish a wind farm on the site in the future is subject to further development approval, and at this stage that would be assessed by the state government. And a range of commercial and physical considerations, not least is the demonstrated meteorological suitability of the site for such purposes. The application was publicly notified, and there were 3 submissions received during this period. In summary, the matters related to visual impact, separation from sensitive receptors, noise impact, impact on wildlife and fauna, compliance with statutory public notification procedures, and that the proposal itself would ultimately lead to an establishment of a wind farm. Whilst a detailed response to these matters is provided within the report, the following comments made. If I could just go to attachment 3 while I'm talking. Now, given that the purpose of the mast is to obtain meteorological data to assist in determining the suitability of that site being suitable for a future wind farm, it's not practical to consider a reduced height. The mast itself has been purposely sized to ensure that the measurements and data collected accurately indicate the meteorological conditions experienced of any future wind turbine generator hub height, so hence the very high height. Nevertheless, given the lightweight slimline lattice construction of the structure, it's not considered to have a detrimental impact on the scenic qualities of the area. Despite being a distinctive element within the rural landscape, the structure itself is only clearly visible when viewed from close proximity. When considering the setback of the mast from the Gore Highway site frontage, and that's approximately 1 kilometre away, so if we, as I say, that's the mast there, and then you've got the Gore Highway running along there. The visual impact of the structure is reasonably diminished. Similarly, the mast itself is well separated from nearest sensitive receptors, with the closest dwelling situated approximately 2.3 kilometres south-east from the base of the mast. Additionally, as noted previously, the mast itself is only operational and a visual element in the landscape for a restricted period. The mast has an anticipated lifespan of up to 5 years, after which time all infrastructure and equipment will be removed and the land returned to pre-development state. So the proposed development has been assessed against all relevant assessment benchmarks, including the entire planning scheme to the extent relevant, and the state planning policy as outlined in the report. The proposed development generally complies with the planning scheme or can be conditioned to comply. A further detailed assessment of matters of non-compliance are detailed within the report. So therefore, the proposed development is recommended to be approved subject to reasonable and relevant conditions. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Councillors, any questions for the planner? Thank you. Councillor McMahon?
Thanks, Chair. A couple of questions.
Yep.
Can you help me with my maths? The attachment 6, 65,000 mil.
Tim, can you speak into the mic, if you wouldn't mind?
Sorry?
65,000 mil, does that mean 65 metres high?
Attachment 6, sorry? What? What one? The actual height of the mast? You
Yeah.
mean? The height of the mast is actually probably around 102 metres from natural ground level.
Right.
But we've given it a maximum height of 105, and that's just to allow for equipment potentially to attach to the top. So there's a little bit of variance there.
So 102 metres, and I note the sensitive receptor, the closest, is like two and a bit k's away.
Yep, that's the one to the southeast, I think, or southeast. Yep.
Oh yeah, that one good. That's probably fairly visible from 2.3 k's away at 100 metres high.
I think it's that one there. You can barely see it. I'm sorry, it's that one there, I should say. Yep.
So have we got submissions from these sensitive receptors on?
We got 3 submissions altogether, and they basically focus on the visual aspect amongst other matters, which I've noted. I guess, as I've noted in the report, there's no way that you can hide a structure that's 105 metres high, but in saying that, the structure itself's not a solid monopole, it's actually a lattice steel construction. It's a galvanised structure. We've actually conditioned that it be galvanised. And in reality, when you look at these types of structures, they tend to be dominant when you're close to them or you're looking for them. As I said, when you're travelling along the Gore Highway, given its location, yes, if you're looking for it, you will see it. There's no question. But in saying that, the further you get away from it, it tends to sit within the environment less. It's not as dominating as you may think, I suppose, but certainly you'll see it. There's no way that you can't see it.
Yeah, no, sure.
Yeah.
Thanks for that. Just a further question, if I may, Chair. I just wanted some clarification. I appreciate that this is an earmarked site for a wind farm, but today we're talking about this tower.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you said the wind farm will be a state government decision, so it won't come before us.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering, as the member of the general community who may have objections towards this wind farm that they want us to take, is the only step they have in hearing those objections before council to talk against this, or will there be other ways that down the track, should the next stages happen, that the general public can have their concerns heard?
Certainly that's a separate process because it's not council assessing it. They'll have a separate sort of, I suppose, legislative requirement that they go through, and that may involve community consultation. Because I'm not involved with that process, I can't comment on that. But what I can say is ultimately the mast itself is simply a monitoring device. I think for the last year or 2 years, as I'm informed, I think they've had smaller little trailers scattered around the area getting data in relation to wind and all the rest of it. And that this is basically to give, my understanding is that, yes, they are serious about a wind farm, but this is probably one of the final steps to sort of secure investors in that regard, to make sure any data that they record is sort of accurate over that 5-year period. But in saying that, it is a commercial decision. This by no means means that there will be a wind farm here. There may not be. And as I alluded to, it is separate process to go through in relation to that. So unfortunately, no, council at this stage, unless there's a change to the planning regs, we don't. It's not an actual decision that council officers make or council makes, but it does go to the state. And as part of that, they will have a consultation period of sorts. But the details of that, unfortunately, I'm not familiar with.
Thanks for your best answer. I appreciate it.
And we can only decide on what's before us
Oh,
too.
absolutely.
So, yeah. Councillor Bonhoff and then Councillor Taylor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. On page 53 of board books, one of the issues raised by the submitters is noise impact. Mm-hmm. And one of the things stated on page 54 is that the concerns are not given enormous credence, but nonetheless, it says that to ensure the development complies with the noise policy, a condition has been recommended allowing council to request the applicant undertake further noise investigations. Mm-hmm. Should council receive a complaint of noise nuisance. Mm-hmm. And then on page 11 of board books, when we're talking about the conditions, condition 27, I believe, is the one that's pertinent to what I was just discussing. Mm-hmm. And it says, if council gets a request in writing to look into a noise complaint, mm-hmm. that information of the investigation has to come back to council within 28 days. And I read that and I thought, there's nowhere in there that stipulates how quickly council then has to respond to the people who put in the request. And that's my first question. Where do I find how quickly council commits to getting back to the actual requestors? And my second question is, 28 days, if I put myself in the shoes of somebody who is perturbed by a noise complaint or a potential noise complaint, 28 days of living with that before a response is quite a while. Is that standard? And do we ever do shortened periods? Could you answer those two, please? Thank you.
Yep, I can attempt to. At the end of the day, I suppose 2 points. Number one is that when you research these types of towers and the way that these masts are designed and the way they tension the wires, there's no real data to suggest that there'd be any real audible noise that you'd experience from, particularly from the actual boundary of the property. Look, on a windy day, maybe when you're standing under it, you may get something depending on which way the wind's blowing and all the rest of it. But it's certainly not going to be an extent that it would be any particular nuisance. So I would suggest that it's not going to necessarily be a whistling structure in the wind. However, in the event that something does crop up or there is I guess something that the designers have not accounted for, we've put that provision in there in case an adjoining landowner or a member of the public does have an issue. The reason for the period is because you need to give the actual complainant, the person responding to the complaint, has to have appropriate time to sort of record or actually accurately sort of give some sort of advice in relation to that. Equally, in response in time from council, if a complaint's made, it's handled no different to any other complaint in that council would keep the complainant updated throughout the process. It's not something that we would condition in an approval because it's the response time for us to get back to a complainant is not. It's not something that the applicant has to deal with. That's an internal process. So that's why we don't put anything in there in terms of us responding, our response times. But as I say, we would do a complaint. We would keep a complainant up to date throughout the process, I suppose, is how I'd respond to that.
Councillor Carrollton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I note on page 14, and it really kind of worries me, where it says it is noted that whilst no lighting is currently proposed on the Met mast, maybe future requirement from Air Services Australia for safety warning lights. A lot of light aircraft and even ultralights are around these days. Have we got no responsibility to approach Air Services Australia to have a light put on the top of that tower? It's not a wide or noticeable structure as such, and certainly at night time you wouldn't see it.
Yeah.
And I really feel strongly about this. I was trying to find it and I've just found it. I didn't think that I thought it said there wasn't a necessity, but I believe there should be.
Yeah.
For the lighting to be on that. And if we put this in here now, we should, I believe, have checked with Air Services Australia. And I believe that we should make it mandatory that they have a light on top of it.
So in response to that, in terms of the process that we follow, it's actually not under any sort of, I suppose, flight path or any actual overlay under the scheme. So in terms of actual lighting, there's no specific requirement under the planning scheme for us to impose that condition. The comment that we make, I think it's under one of the actual comments we make else there is that the actual applicant has, through the process, as a separate party, referred to both the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, or CASA, and Air Services Australia, which is what they need to do. They've come back with preliminary response saying that at this stage there's absolutely no requirement at this stage to put a light on it. But in saying that, once the structure is actually located, the height is actually confirmed, it's up to, I suppose, CASA and Air Services Australia to determine whether there's an actual safety issue there and whether a light would have to be on that tower. In saying that, if there were a light, it would probably be no different to any other light that you see on one of those other sort of telecommunication type towers in the areas where they're basically either a red or a green. I mean, that's up to...
It would be a light.
There would be a little light, but it certainly won't You may see it in the night sky, but it certainly
Well, you
wouldn't.
would see
but
it in the
but
night
it won't.
sky.
Yeah, but it won't sort of, I suppose, create to actual light nuisance per se.
No,
Yeah.
I'm talking about being a safety issue for light aircraft and ultralights and people who are flying around at night time. It's 100 metres
Yep.
into the air where there was nothing.
Yep.
And I believe that there needs to be a light on it. And if the planning regs don't allow us to do that, then I think that's a failure.
Yeah. I guess, as I stated, it will have to pass the actual safety standards for the actual CASA and Air Services Australia. So I suspect to be compliant, and if a light's required, they'll impose that requirement.
So I just have a follow-up there. If someone hits it, then they'll decide they need one.
Actually, Richard, my hang on, sorry, Stuart. My question was along the same sort of lines about the about aircraft. So, what's the process like once it's built? Is there a follow up there from CASA, or like how does that work?
So yeah, the applicant's probably in a better place to explain that, and I don't know whether at this point we
can
want to
clarify that. Yeah, okay.
pass that on when we. Yep.
Thanks, Richard.
I was just thinking that maybe an advice note
We could.
would be the way to
Yeah,
go,
I'd
just
be
to
happy
ensure
with that,
that,
thank you.
because there's the conditions on the approval and the advice notes
I'd be
are also
happy.
attached, and we could have a CASA advice note. We've
Thank you.
done that before,
Thank you.
and it's probably the way forward. I fully understand your concern there, though,
We
you
have-
know, to have a night flight licence in an aircraft, whether it's ultra or normal light aircraft, you have special training and you make sure where you're flying there's none of these things. However, I would still like to think there was a red light on it if I was flying, so...
So, Madam Chair, I'd just like to follow that up. We have an aerodrome in Millmerran, and
That's
we
right.
have Qantas pilots training out here with them landing on all three of Council's aerodromes, which is Toowoomba, Millmerran and Pittsworth. So there's increased, at times, in their training, increased traffic out there. I would think I'd be happy to have something like that on there. I'd prefer to have a light, but thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Shine.
I'm just wondering what industry or activity is undertaken by neighbours or submitters in this case as well, and would they, any evidence or suggestion that that sort of activity would be interfered with by the Met mast?
I guess once again that's probably an applicant question. I suspect there'd be nothing necessarily, an activity occurring nearby that would necessarily interfere with any of those measurements. But once again, if there is something, I suspect that's something that the applicant would be aware of.
Be mainly cattle, if anything, one assumes. But
Yeah, as alluded to, I mean, in terms of the actual operations of the site, the cattle grazing can still continue. They just basically put a bit of cattle fencing around the sort of base of the Met mast base and around the sort of the guy wire mounting points. And I think, as we alluded to too, obviously, if someone's daring enough, I think they put eddy climb type prevention mechanisms at the base of the tower as well, even though it is on private property.
can I ask you another one? Thank you. In your experience, has there been any issues with these Met masts in other places in the region?
From our council's point of view, I'm not familiar, but certainly, as I say, certainly from just reviewing what I could find out in the assessment of the report, it's a relatively benign structure. It's as I say, it's really just got that height because ultimately that's where a wind turbine would have to be if they went and put a wind farm there. And ultimately, they just line the side of it with all the measuring devices, really. So, no, I'm not aware of anything necessarily,
Thank
no.
you.
Councillor McDonald.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thanks through to you to Richard. Richard, is this the normal process that people would go through to do this testing first before an application? So this is pretty standard.
Yeah. As I sort of stated earlier, I think, and once again, the applicant probably knows this more than me because this was prior to it being lodged. I believe for a year or maybe even longer than that, they've actually had these smaller trailers scattered throughout there, I think, taking measurements. So they've certainly done their initial review. This is probably one of the later phases in basically shoring up that information, and then that will feed into whether, I guess, it's a viable site for what they're looking at doing. The Met mast itself, because it's not combined with the wind farm application, that's why we're seeing it today. it's basically an undefined use because it's not really been something that you would necessarily envisage in a planning scheme. But yeah, it's standard practice, and the 5-year, well, maximum 5 year is basically to give that certainty around the data they collect before they go into making a financial decision to go forward with it.
That was my second question about the 5 years. Thank you.
Yep.
That's good.
Thank you. Councillor Carl.
Just a comment, Madam Chair, if I may. This is like deja vu, Back to the Future for me. Crow's Nest Council days, wind farm project. I can most assuredly say that just because there's wind monitoring towers go up, it not necessarily be the outcome that a wind farm eventuates. Hence, the wind monitoring towers, I don't even know whether they're still there, but there was 2, 3, I stand to be corrected. Matthew would be, the senior planner would pick me up on that, but over that period of time, I was not aware of any complaints of any nature around, particularly around the monitoring towers. And noise, I struggle to even imagine how there'd be any noise from those towers. And the position of them in relation to, I was just looking at the topographical maps, the width of the contour lines there, it's fairly undulating country where this is going to be located. The wind monitoring towers out at Crow's Nest were up on top of ridges, very visible, and you could barely see them. So, and I dare say that in the future, if a wind farm does eventuate, that'll be a discussion for the state government. Interestingly now, it wasn't back then. It's alternate energy supply is a very topical discussion now. State are obviously calling that in. So those land owners might actually welcome a source of income for the life of the project if they actually end up with a wind tower on their farm. So they're all the things that the state will deal with now. So, but I'm not aware of my past experience. I'm not aware of any problems whatsoever. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Yeah, Councillor Summerfield.
Could I just get a clarification, please, from you, Councillor Bill, in relation... so I was of the understanding that if the results of this testing tower actually, or measuring tower, I suppose you call it, not a testing tower, came back to support that a wind farm could go there, it would still have to come to council as a DA, which we would then approve, not state government.
No.
But that's the change I was most interested in, because it'll be obviously a state significant project around alternate energy. Back in the day, it did come back to council, and the issue that divided the community at that stage was that some landowners were going to be paid a sum of money for the positioning of towers, and other neighbouring landowners wouldn't be paid, and that was the crux of the issues back then. So,
maybe to attempt to answer that question, as I sort of alluded to earlier, I suppose, through the process of if an application's made with the state, they will basically seek comment from the local authority, us, and at that point we would have the opportunity to put any concerns forward at that phase. But ultimately, we're not the one who authorises it or not.
Just to follow up from your comment, Councillor Carl, if the wind farm didn't go ahead, you'd hope, according to this process, that monitoring tower is gone, those ones from the Crow's Nest days, you would hope?
Well, the reason why they're still there, and my understanding, and if they're all still there, they may not be, is because, back to the planner's comment around a commercial decision, just because it tests positive and good wind current and the volume of wind and the extent of those winds over the seasons doesn't mean to say it still comes back to a commercial decision, and the ownership of those towers and that footprint from a planning perspective, there was 2, perhaps 3 changes of hand in ownership on the commercial entities that owned that. That's why those wind towers are still there.
But, Councillor, I'm on the understanding that if it doesn't go ahead, it has to be rehabilitated
Yeah.
within, yeah.
In this instance, we've actually got a
Yes,
condition
okay.
about
Yeah, it
cessation
may
of
not
use,
have that
so we've
condition.
covered that
Okay,
aspect
sure.
so that it
Yeah.
actually does have to be removed.
Okay, yeah. Councillor Summerfield?
And that approval would have
Thank you,
lapsed.
Madam Chair. So I just wonder whether the report, or maybe it does in there somewhere and I didn't see it, but the report should reflect that this could become a state project and not go through the DA process, because in here I believe
Yeah.
read that it would still have to come back to us for an approval. So if that's not necessarily the case, should the report perhaps reflect that?
Yeah, the report itself makes reference to, I think, in the executive summary, where we basically put in brackets that it would actually be a state process. I guess in saying that too, we've also tried to make it clear that we can only assess the application that's before us. So I've not got the ability or the capability to assess a potential wind farm or what potential impacts that may have anyway.
Thanks, Richard.
Okay, if there's no further questions, we do have a submitter, Beverly Mackenzie, who'd like to come and speak to us. Beverly, thank you. Welcome, Beverly. You just need to speak into the microphone so everyone can hear you, and you've got 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to speak on behalf of the submitters to this application. While we understand that this development application is in no way giving approval for the future wind farm, it is of concern to us that any changes to the material use of the land involved is part of the initial stage of the process. This may be preemptive, but we wish to make it known so that when the time comes for the wind farm application, it has been noted that there are concerns. In regard to the response of the planning agency for the application, there were a couple of points that arose. They said that there was a photograph of an existing tower and you could hardly see it in the distance, but photographs, especially those taken on mobile phones, don't accurately show what you can see with your eyes. Objects can appear smaller and harder to discern in the photograph, and it never truly captures the subject at a distance. There are other structures in the surrounding area, yes, but these are in locations that provide some sort of screening or background to make their visual impact less. We have the towers for the high voltage power lines running past. They are 50 metres tall, and that's significantly shorter than the mast that is proposed. The towers that are there for the high voltage lines have the mountains behind them, and that provides a backdrop that reduces their intrusiveness. They've been there for 20 years and they still haven't dulled down in their brightness. The mast will be in a much more open space, it's undulating, and some of the sensitive receptors, our house, is on a level with it, so we will see it directly. Yes, I suppose if we look for it, we'll see it, but it will be there. And while the mast is to be constructed on land that is already cleared and is currently being used for agricultural purposes, the issue of birds of prey flying into the tower or the guy wires still remains a concern to us. There's eagles nesting on those mountains and they fly over those plains. I'm concerned, could they hit these wires? I suppose the trade-off is if we paint them bright red, they might see them, but then we'll see them too. And the issue of the colour, the lighting and the possible noise from vibrating guy wires was addressed in the response, and I thank the planning agency for that. And I acknowledge and apologise for the error about referring to Site 2 in this particular application. I didn't understand how the documents were working for the PD online, so I note that this is just for the Gore Highway site. We ask that you please keep in mind the bigger picture of what a successful application to the change of use for this land may lead to. Thank you.
Stay there, Beverly. You might have some questions, Beverly. Any questions or comments for Beverly? Councillor Taylor?
Not questions, Madam Chair, but a comment. You would realise, Beverly, after listening to the conversation, that it won't be us that will be making that decision.
I know.
So, and I don't know where that kind of leaves you, because always with the local government you do have opportunity to at least put forward your concerns and views, so you, fullness of time, have to watch what happens with the state agency.
Yes,
Thank you.
Councillor McDonald?
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you, Beverly. Thank you for coming in and talking with us today. On the map there, can you just show us which, or well, maybe Richard might show us where you're located? Are you the nearest receptor that Richard showed?
No, we're not the nearest one for this one. Site 2, we are the nearest one.
Okay. You just got to shoot it to the little monitor. Might need a hand there.
Got to hold your mouth right.
So you're there.
That's thanks, Beverly.
You are not level.
Yes. Yes, our house is up a rise in the foothills of the mountains behind.
What would the distance be, if I may ask, between your place and there?
What's the distance?
Yeah. What would be the distance from your spot to the mast?
For this one, it's pretty close to 4 kilometres.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Well done, Beverly.
Thank you.
Terrific. We do have Andrew Bullen who's going to come and speak on behalf of the applicant.
Thank you, Madam Chair and councillors, for the opportunity to speak to the application. I'll probably just focus on, I think, some of the issues raised by the submitters. And look, we fully appreciate that the issues raised by the submitters are genuinely held concerns that they have. We did actually provide a response to those as the application went through the process, and a lot of what Richard has relayed today reflects some of that. But I just want to touch on a couple of points because there probably are some concerns that in possession of all the facts are probably less of a concern. I'd like to think they're less of a concern. So if I'd start with visual impact, the design of the mast is purposely a very slimline, lightweight lattice design. In one of the submissions that came in, there was an example provided, which was a fairly chunky example, if you like, and it was a mast that was painted red and white. That actually isn't, and I don't think there was anything intentional in that, it was just something that one of the submitters had put in as an example. But that was a different type of mast. It wasn't associated with a wind farm. The design of it was quite heavy. It was painted because it was near an airport and all those sorts of things. So there was a report, there was a photo in the report that we submitted which is a live example showing what this mast would look like, the exact mast from 700 metres. Do take on board the submitter's point that a photo probably never, in honesty, fully represents the situation, but literally at 700 metres it is difficult to discern that mast. Now, you do see these when you're up close, but any sort of distance, they are visible, sure, but they fade into the background. And what I would say is that something being visible isn't automatically synonymous with it having an adverse visual impact. So yes, it's high, but visual impact comes back to things like colour and dominance in the landscape, bulk and those sorts of things. And on many of those measures, this mast is purposely designed to visually integrate. In not only the design of the mast, but also where it's positioned, as Richard has covered and the submitters have covered, there's a high degree of visual separation or physical separation between the surrounding sensitive receptors and the mast itself. We can confirm there was some concerns initially about it being reflective. It will definitely not be reflective. It's a galvanised steel treatment, which won't be reflective whatsoever. It certainly won't be painted. As I said, the masts that are painted are usually ones in proximity to airports where that's required by CASA or Air Services Australia. The issue on lighting and safety, while I take on board Councillor Taylor's concerns, what the applicant has sought to do here, the very experienced providers, Vestas internationally of these facilities, is there was quite a degree of consultation right up front because there was some ambiguity between the state regulatory regime for wind farms and masts like this that are potentially associated with a future wind farm, and where the council process was. And this application was really a bit of an adjunct to get the state to make a call, which they did, and they said at this point in time, this should go through council. The way the legislation reads, it's still fairly ambiguous, but in the future, I think it's more likely than not that it will go through a state process. And the issue with that is that the applicant has always sought to comply with whatever law or requirements it has to, whether that's imposed by the state or the council. If a wind farm ever does proceed on this site, and they will comply with whatever the process is at the time, again, more likely to be a state process, but there will definitely be a consultation phase in that based on other facilities, even if run by the state. And equally too, I'd have to say, dealing with a number of renewable energy projects, I've been fairly impressed with Vesta's approach in being a good corporate citizen. They've done extensive consultation. I'm sure the submitters have met Elise Wise, who's here from Vestas today, as a representative of the applicant. I know there's been a lot of informal consultation with council staff and councillors, and that effort's been made. Certainly if it progressed to the next stage, that there'd be a real intention to do that and make sure any concerns were taken on board, both in a statutory process but also from the applicant's point of view. I can confirm on noise, the design of these facilities, the thickness of the cables, the tension of the cables, is that noise quite simply hasn't been an issue with these facilities. So, I mean, there's nothing wrong with council having a condition that allows them to go back and ask for an assessment if that issue should ever emerge. We're very confident it won't. It certainly hasn't to date. And in any event, the approval or the conditions that are recommended also impose requirements for noise to meet the established standards which any use would be required to meet. So it's not being treated effectively any different from anything else from a noise perspective. And obviously the applicant will be obliged to meet those requirements. Again, impacts on wildlife. There is no, based on past experience, concerns coming out regarding adverse impacts on wildlife or flora and fauna. It's been purposely cited to avoid any point. I just wanted to touch on was this concept of we're having, met mast is being put up, and therefore it's automatic there will be a wind farm that will follow. And I think, as Councillor Cahill relayed his past experience, that certainly is the case. It is not the case, I should say. We've gone to great pains to explain that. There's a range of factors which will contribute to that final decision, one of which is the physical suitability of the site, and that's really what this tower's there to measure. That's not the only consideration, and it could well pan out that the site is physically suitable, but a wind farm does not proceed for a range of other matters which Vestas have to take into account. In terms of the other issue was the safety issue in terms of lighting. What the applicant did do, as they do as a matter of course, is they went to Air Services Australia and CASA and consulted them about their requirements. So went and said, this is what we're proposing to do, what requirements do we have to meet. Those agencies have come back and said, look, essentially at this point of time, what you have to do when you build the mast, they put it onto a database and some mapping, which is used by people flying planes and whatever in the area. They said at this point in time there isn't a requirement for a light on it, so they haven't mandated that, but they reserve the right, as they typically do, to come back and ask you to do that. So again, the applicant will respond in whatever way the regulator requires. So if we're required to do it, they will do it. But at this stage in time, that's been the formal feedback from those agencies. One final thing, jumping back quickly onto the visual impact side of things, and I note the submitter raised the point about the high voltage power lines, which by their own admission probably seem to be a lot closer than this will be. I probably would make the point, yes, they aren't as high as what we're talking about here, but high voltage power lines and the towers that go with those are generally much bigger and more bulky and more visual in the landscape. As I said, this will be visible, but if you do see examples of where you get any sort of distance from really 700 metres on, they really do blend in the background and are meant to do that. So I think that answers most of the key concerns that the submitters raised. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Councillors? Councillor Shine?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. Just in relation to the property as a whole there, is that the highest point or part of the highest point where it's planned to be?
The property, my recollection of it from when I was out there on site, is relatively level. The land in the area does undulate a little bit, but not massively. The reason for the 3 separate parcels being in is that the access comes off Gore Highway, and the access track, which you can see on that plan there, is the red line that goes over the other 2 properties and then to where it is. I'm not sure if there are other technical reasons. Elise might be able to answer that as to why it went there on the property, other than the planning constraints. If happy, Madam?
Yes, Lise, yeah. You probably need to come up here to a microphone, Elise, if you could. We can't hear you. The one in the middle would be fine, yeah. Lovely, thank you.
That's okay. It's a great question. It's actually one of the lowest points of the area in general. What we like to do is we actually have 2 applications coming through at slightly different times due to different complexities with those sites. One will be very low within the area, one will be slightly higher, and that gives us a really good understanding of how the wind will change in the shear with the height of the general area.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Andrew, if hopefully Vestas won't go belly up, what happens if they do, and what's the sort of the fallback in terms of removing things like this?
Yeah, okay. Well, probably like any use in that situation, any conditions would go with the land, so they would still be an obligation on the landholder, even though they're not. So technically, if it came to that. Vestas are, I mean, we're seeing, just for the interest of councillors, particularly from overseas companies, a real push on renewable energy projects in Australia. Vestas obviously is based in Melbourne in Australia, but they originate from Denmark. We're doing other work in the area with European Energy and others. And I think it is a sign of the times with what's happening with energy policy, or the lack thereof, depending on what side of the fence you sit on. But it is driving a lot of interest, not so much from Australian firms, but certainly investors from outside the country. Vestas, as I understand, are the largest manufacturer of wind turbines in the world, and are very, so I mean, if, any business can go out of business, but probably there's a lot of pedigree and capital behind it. But in a purely technical sense, if there was a condition that required compliance with, and whoever had established that tower went out of business, that would be a requirement that council could impose on the landholder. That would be technically their obligation then.
Thank you. Any other questions for Andrew? No? Well done. Okay. Thank you.
Right. Thanks very much.
Can I have someone move that we reinstate standing orders, please? Councillor Summerfield, Councillor Shine, all those in favour? Okay, so the recommendation is that council approve the application for a development permit for a material change of use, impact, undefined use, a Met mast. Do I have someone to move that? Councillor Carl? Councillor... so we want to amend the notes for the advice note.
Thank you.
Sorry, yeah. Oh, it's in yellow there, yeah. Are you happy with that, Councillor Taylor?
Yes, I'm happy with it. And I mean, after listening to Andrew, and thank you, Andrew, for those comments, but it'd be so much easier to do something as it's being erected rather than to try to retrofit it. So,
Just by way of process, should that just not be in the motion rather than be in there?
Be guided.
You've added it into the conditions. Okay.
thank you.
Happy to do that?
Yep.
I'll be guided by you, Brian. Yeah, that's okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a mover, Councillor Carl, seconded Councillor McMahon. All those in favour? It's carried unanimously. The meeting is closed at 2:53. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for that.
Curious.